In today's video, we are discussing rear mount / remote mount turbo setups. So engine in the front and turbo somewhere away from the engine along the back of the vehicle, usually at the very back of the vehicle. We'll learn the benefits and the drawbacks of this setup, and we'll see if it's actually a stupid idea. And along the way, we're also going to learn some very important lessons about turbocharging and bust some common turbocharging myths. So let's get started. We're going to start with the most obvious question. Why? Why would somebody want to remote mount a turbo in the first place? Well, the primary motivator is usually space or space constraints, because it may be very difficult to find the required space for a turbo and all of its associated plumbing in the engine bay of a car that came naturally aspirated from the factory. And even if you do find the space, you may end up requiring a custom one-off exhaust manifold for the turbo if you're working with a platform that doesn't have sufficient aftermarket support, or if you're doing some sort of engine swap. And if you don't have the fabrication equipment and or skills, such a one-off exhaust manifold may become a very expensive, probably the most expensive item on your parts list. But even with the space found and exhaust manifold fabricated, the location that you choose for the turbo, that you are forced to choose for the turbo, may end up requiring complex routing of the intake piping or the exhaust downpiping or both, and this may negatively impact performance. On top of this, a turbocharger is a major source of heat, so the space you are forced to choose for it may end up actually negatively impacting some of the components around the turbo because of the added heat, causing their lifespan to be reduced. A remote mount turbo setup is sort of a path of least resistance towards solving these problems of space and heat. And a remote mount setup is actually a two birds one stone affair, because by locating the turbo somewhere along the back of the car, you get access to all of this space. Especially if you go all the way to the back, you're usually going to find a big muffler, one or two of them. And if you get rid of them, the turbos replace the muffler, they sort of become the muffler, and now you have a lot of space at your disposal, and you might even run two turbos instead of one because of all the space you just gained. But you also solved your heat problems because you locate the turbo away from the engine bay. The engine bay and the components in it are no longer exposed to the added heat, plus the turbo itself runs a lot cooler, which means that it's going to last longer. Individuals and companies who specialize in rear mount and remote mount turbo setups and who have completed numerous projects usually report that the temperature of the hot side, the turbine side of the turbo, runs around 300 degrees cooler in a rear mount turbo setup. This is a very significant temperature difference, which means that all of a sudden cooling the turbo becomes much less of a priority. You can run a oil-cooled turbo only instead of a oil and water-cooled turbo, which simplifies install. You do not have to run all the coolant piping all the way to the back, and plus it usually reduces cost because on average oil-cooled only turbos can be a bit cheaper. But if you want to run a water-cooled turbo in the back, that's also a good idea because even better cooling is never a bad idea. But it gets even better. The remote location of the turbo doesn't just save the engine bay from the added heat, it also positively impacts performance. Because the turbo itself runs cooler, it means that it doesn't heat the intake air as much. Plus, we have an almost entire car's length of intake piping through which the air travels, and we have air along the underside of the vehicle passing along this intake piping, so it cools the air even more before it gets into the engine. Now, the cooler the air, the denser it is. The denser the air, the more air we can stuff into the same volume, and more air is more power. Now, this added cooling effect from the remote mount setup isn't as significant as that of a well-placed large intercooler, so ditching the intercooler, in my opinion, is not necessarily a good idea, because it's better to see this added cooling effect from the remote mount setup simply as an added boost to performance that allows better knock prevention, and it can even potentially allow us to run a higher compression ratio in the engine. So it costs less because you don't need a fancy one-off custom exhaust manifold. You get to keep your factory exhaust manifold and still add a turbo to your engine. It potentially improves performance because the air is now cooler, and it reduces engine bay heat, and it saves your components from being toasted by the turbo. So why aren't we all running remote mount setups? Well, as you're probably guessing, there have to be some downsides. Well, if you spend a bit of time online researching rear mount turbos, you're going to run into a very common opinion. And this opinion is as follows. A car with a rear-mount turbo setup is going to have a lot of turbo lag. It's going to feel very lethargic and sluggish when driving. And the turbo lag comes from the fact that the turbo is far away from the engine. So the turbo has to pressurize an entire car's length of intake piping. Of course, pressurizing this takes time, and we experience this time delay as turbo lag. This is simply not true. And this opinion about rear mount and remote mount turbo setups, I believe, comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of the operating principle of the turbocharger and of turbo lag. Let me ask you a very simple question. Here I have two turbochargers. This is a very small turbocharger and it's running at 14.5 psi or 1 bar of boost. This is a very big turbocharger and it's also running at 14.5 psi or 1 bar of boost. Which one of these makes more power? If you say they make the same power, then you have been led into fundamentally misunderstanding how a turbo increases power, because all you've been hearing is boost pressure numbers thrown around. How much boost are you running, man? 30 psi. Whoa, you must be making sick power. No. Boost pressure is not what makes the power. What makes power is airflow, or the amount of air, the air mass, or air volume at a given pressure that we can flow during a certain period of time. The bigger turbo definitely makes more power because it can flow more air mass during the same time, and more air mass means we can add more fuel, and this means a more powerful combustion and more power. In fact, if we take a big turbo running 7 psi of boost and a turbo half the size running 14 psi of boost, the big turbo is still gonna make more power, because the more we pressurize the air, the hotter the air becomes, the less dense it is, and the more difficult it becomes to cool the air back down, make it dense, and make it good for the engine. So ideally, what you want to run is the minimum amount of boost pressure and the maximum amount of airflow for your target power level. But again, you cannot run a giant turbo on a small engine, because the small engine will struggle to produce enough exhaust gas to overcome the inertia of the big heavy turbo wheels of the big turbo, and that's gonna be turbo lag. So ultimately, you cannot have it all. It's impossible with turbos or with anything else in life. Instead, you must prioritize that which matters most to you and sacrifice that which matters least. Now, let's put all of this into the perspective of our rear mount turbo setup. Now, any even relatively modern small frame turbocharger easily flows around 400 cubic feet of air per minute. This is 11,300 liters of air per minute, and that is at 1 bar or 14.5 psi of boost. This gives us around 188 liters of air per second. So even a small turbocharger is more than capable of filling the entire displacement of even the largest car engine many times over in a single second. It must be capable of doing this because when running at 5,000 RPM, a 2-liter 4-cylinder 4-stroke engine consumes 5,000 liters of air per minute, or 83 liters per second. Now let's say that we have 4 meters of intake piping from the back of the car where the turbo is to the engine. Let's say that the intake piping is 2.5 inches in diameter, which is 6.35 centimeters. This gives us a volume of 12.67 liters. Now you might say, whoa, that's 2 6-liter engines that the turbo now has to fill all the time. No, it's not. An engine is constantly consuming air. Intake piping is not. Once the turbo fills this volume, the volume stays filled until you release the throttle, the turbo slows down, and airflow and boost pressure drops. When you get back on the throttle, the 12.67 liters of volume are a drop in the ocean of the turbo's capacity of 188 liters of air per second at 1 bar of boost. And the contribution to lag from the additional 12 liters of volume is negligible because it takes the turbo 0.067 seconds to fill the additional 12 liters. This is something that a human cannot perceive, and it cannot be accurately and repeatedly measured. I think that turbo lag in general is a pretty misunderstood concept, and it's very often mixed up with something else called boost threshold. And This mix-up is actually, I think, the key reason why many people believe that a remote-mounted turbo will be inherently laggy and sluggish. Now, turbo lag, it is the delay in the spool-up of the turbine and the compressor wheels that occurs when you floor it from a closed throttle while you are in the RPM range where the turbo produces boost. Turbo lag is perceived by the driver as a time delay in throttle response. So you floor it, there's a little bit of time where the torque doesn't kick in, and then torque kicks in. This occurs because there's a time delay that is required to overcome the inertia of the compressor and the turbine wheels to get them up to speed. Boost threshold is a different phenomenon, and it is the RPM at which the turbo starts producing significant boost. Now, these two things to a driver feel very similar because a turbocharged car that outside of boost, especially a car with a big turbo, low compression ratio, when the engine is outside of boost, below the boost threshold, the engine will feel sluggish. It will feel a sensation will be very similar to poor throttle response, but it's actually not just poor throttle response, it's a lack of torque. But it feels kind of like the engine is unresponsive. You floor it, but not much happens until you get into the boost threshold, and then you get there, let's say 4,000 RPM, torque kicks in, the car starts accelerating with much more ferocity. And this feels similar to turbo lag. You floor it, nothing happens, and if you floor it below boost threshold, nothing happens. So the feeling is similar, but it's a completely different thing. And here's the deal. Modern turbochargers have pretty much killed traditional turbo lag, because turbo lag has to do with the inertia of the turbine and compressor wheels. Modern turbochargers with their very lightweight billet, titanium, you name it, compressor wheels and very light turbine wheels, together with their ball bearings, center housings, and other innovations, they have become very easy to spool up. They have very little inertia. So something like a Borg-Warner EFR turbo, put it in a car, match it correctly to the engine, the average driver will have a very hard time noticing any turbo lag at all. But here's the important thing here for us for a rear-mounted setup. The length of intake piping that the turbo has between the turbo and the engine, this has nothing to do with the inertia of the compressor and the turbine wheels, and therefore the length of the intake piping doesn't really contribute to turbo lag in any significant way. As we have seen, that's around 0.06 seconds. That doesn't exist. So a remote-mounted turbo, does it contribute to turbo lag? No. But does it contribute to an increased boost threshold? Yes, it does. So where does the increased boost threshold come from? If the problem isn't the intake piping, then it must be the exhaust piping, because the exhaust gas must travel the added distance through the piping from the engine to the turbo. It takes some time for the exhaust gas to cover this distance, and this leads to an increased boost threshold. No. Exhaust gas travels at around 120 meters per second. Let's say that your car is 4 meters long. You have 4 meters of exhaust piping. The 4 added meters adds a 0.03 seconds of added time for the exhaust gas to get to the turbo. So, no. The problem with the added length of exhaust piping is that it drains the energy from the exhaust gas. This is what causes an increased boost threshold. Often in my videos when talking about turbochargers, I say that it is the heat energy of the exhaust gas that drives the turbo. And almost always I get a comment saying, you're wrong, it's the kinetic energy. And yes, I'm wrong. It is the kinetic energy. But I say this on purpose, because you have to ask yourself, where does the kinetic energy come from? If the exhaust gas were somehow magically cold, would they have the same kinetic energy? Definitely not. When the exhaust valve opens inside an engine, the hot and pressurized gas starts escaping even without the action, the upward pushing action of the piston. In fact, much of the exhaust gas escapes out the engine even before the piston does anything about it. Think of it as a hot oven. When you open the doors of a hot oven, does the hot air stay inside? It most certainly does not. Instead, it comes rushing out and you get that little heat wave on your face. Exhaust gas works the same way. The problem with a remote mount turbo is that the exhaust gas, as it travels to the increased length of piping, loses its kinetic energy. It loses it because it's passing heat onto the piping. It's passing it onto the surface area of the piping, and then the surrounding air rushing underneath the car cools down the piping. The piping transfers the heat onto the surrounding air. So in order to make up for the reduced kinetic energy of the exhaust gas, which it wastes as it travels through this piping, we have to add more exhaust gas to get the same turbine speed. In other words, we need to rev higher because more RPM is more exhaust gas. We are making up for the reduced quality of the exhaust gas with increased exhaust gas quantity, which ends up being an increased boost threshold. We have to rev to a higher RPM to spin things up to speed and produce significant boost. Now, we can't really get rid of this negative effect of the increased exhaust piping length, but we can reduce it, and it's all about trying to keep the heat in there. So the first way to reduce the negative effect is to wrap or otherwise insulate the exhaust piping. This will prevent or reduce the effect of the exhaust gases passing their heat and thus kinetic energy onto the surrounding air. It prevents the surrounding air from cooling the exhaust piping too much, from passing too much heat onto the surrounding air. So it's all about insulating, keeping the heat in the exhaust gas. So wrapping, once, twice, some sort of shielding from the air all helps. The number two thing you can do is to choose the correct size of the exhaust piping. Don't go too big. It's better to be conservative and go smaller, because the formula for surface area of a cylinder or a pipe has radius square in it. A 10% increase in pipe diameter leads to a 20% increase in surface area. And more surface area is simply more surface for the exhaust gas to pass its heat onto the pipe, to lose its heat, to lose its kinetic energy. So the more surface area you have, the higher your boost threshold is going to be. The final thing you can do to help your engine is to choose a smaller turbine wheel, or even better, if you can find a good one, a suitable one, a variable geometry turbo. A small turbine wheel takes less exhaust gas to get up to speed, so it's going to reduce your boost threshold. But if you go too small, you're going to end up choking your engine at high RPM and reduce your maximum power output. A variable geometry turbo can really help a remote mount setup, in that the variable geometry turbo acts like a small turbine wheel at low RPM, but like a bigger turbine wheel at high RPM. So if you can find a suitable one, and if you can afford it, it's definitely a good idea for a remote mount setup. Now, there are three more issues that we must discuss related to remote mount setups, and they are noise, oil return, and potential for damage. If you have run a full factory muffler setup before, be prepared for increased noise levels, and that is because your turbos are now your mufflers. You have to get rid of the mufflers, and you cannot install mufflers before the turbos, especially not chambered mufflers, because mufflers are essentially designed to waste the energy of the exhaust gas in order to reduce its noise, and that's going to definitely negatively impact how your turbos operate and how much power you make and your boost threshold and everything. So mufflers are out of the window. Now, turbos are pretty good mufflers themselves, but they're not mufflers, and the sound likely won't be too obnoxious, but it will be increased noise. However, there is a little upside here, because the turbos are now outside of the engine. All the turbo noises will be very audible. So for example, if you decide to run without ball valves, the turbo, all the stu-tu-tu-tu-tus are going to be very audible, because the turbo isn't muffled by the confines of the engine bay and all the sound insulation of the engine bay. So depending on your application, this might be a fun little benefit. The second issue is oil return. The turbo is now very far away from the engine, and it's very low. It is usually at the level of the sump, which means that you will need scavenging pumps, heavy-duty scavenging pump, maybe even two, to get oil from the turbo back into the sump or anywhere else on the engine. Now, there's again a hidden little benefit here. Although you have to run the pumps now, the length of the oil return lines means that you likely won't require an external oil cooler, because the oil will be cooled as it has to travel back from the turbo to the engine. However, you will need quite a bit of oil. This is going to also increase your oil capacity, which again is a hidden little benefit, because more oil is usually better. The third issue is the potential for damage, because remember, we now have exhaust and intake piping very low towards the ground. The turbos are very low towards the ground. The intake air filters are also likely going to be very close towards the ground, which means that getting debris or rocks or something to damage the turbos or the intake pipings becomes a increased chance of that happening. Plus the increased length of the intake and exhaust piping means that we have an increased chance for exhaust and boost leaks. Again, if everything is executed properly, these risks can be minimized, but they are there and they should be mentioned. Plus the intake air filters, unless you route them somewhere, are going to get wet and dirtier much sooner than if you put them somewhere in a good spot in the engine bay. Okay, let's sum it up. Here we have the benefits, here we have the drawbacks. Is it a stupid idea? No, it is not, and it is most certainly not as laggy as some of the people who tend to lean towards one or the other extreme might try to convince you about this setup. It is definitely a viable alternative and creative solution to a very common problem. And just like anything else, it has its benefits and its drawbacks, and it's up to you to see which of these weigh more for your particular application and make the decision if you were considering a setup like this. Overall, I think that it is more suited towards something track-oriented, let's say a weekend warrior racer, a drift car, something like that, because with cars like this, you're going to be spending most of the time at high RPM above the boost threshold, so you really don't care about the increased boost threshold. But if you're considering this for something that you're going to be driving on the street most of the time, it's a bit of a waste because you'll be spending a lot of the time in the sluggish area of the RPM range. You won't really be harnessing the benefits most of the time. You'll be feeling more of the drawbacks. If you're considering a setup like this for something like rally driving, dirt, gravel, no. So yeah, it is, as I said, a viable and interesting alternative which has some pretty important benefits, and it can be a lifesaver for certain setups. So yeah, that's pretty much it. As always, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon with more fun and useful stuff on the D4A channel.